There is something no one prepares you for, not the grief, not the loss, not the silence that follows when someone you love is gone, something more fundamental than any of that, the complete absence of any serious answer to the most important question a human being can ask. What actually happens when we die? Not what we are supposed to believe, not what a particular religion teaches, or a particular culture assumes, or a particular philosopher speculated about 2,000 years ago. But what actually happens, what the evidence points to, what the most rigorous investigations into this question have actually found. The modern world has almost nothing to say here. Science tells us that consciousness is produced by the brain, and when the brain stops, consciousness stops. That is the official position, and yet the scientists who study consciousness most carefully, the ones who have spent entire careers investigating how the brain produces subjective experience, will tell you privately that they have no idea how it does this. The hard problem of consciousness remains completely unsolved. We do not actually understand how matter becomes awareness. We have no credible explanation for why there is something it is like to be you. We can describe the neural correlates of experience. We can map which brain regions activate when you feel fear or joy or recognition. We can trace the electrochemical processes that accompany conscious states with increasing precision. But none of this explains why those processes are accompanied by subjective experience at all, why there is an inside to the process, why it feels like something to be a brain rather than simply operating like one. This is not a minor gap in our knowledge. It is the deepest unsolved problem in all of science, and it matters enormously for the question of death. Because if we do not understand how consciousness arises from matter, we cannot be confident that it ends when matter stops. And into that silence, the ancient world left something extraordinary. Not speculation, not mythology, not the desperate comfort of people who could not face the reality of death. Maps. Precise, detailed, carefully transmitted maps of what happens to consciousness after the body stops. Maps that were developed not by philosophers sitting in comfortable rooms, but by initiates who had spent years preparing for exactly this investigation, and who reported with extraordinary consistency across completely separate civilizations what they found. Ancient Egypt, Tibet, India, the Hermetic tradition of the ancient Mediterranean. They did not communicate with each other. They did not share texts. They arose in different climates, different languages, different historical circumstances, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. And yet the map they drew of what happens after death is, at its essential structure, the same map. Tonight we are going to read that map, not because death is coming, though it is for all of us, because understanding what these traditions actually discovered changes something about how you live right now, about what you are afraid of, about what you think you are. And because the modern world, for all its sophistication, has left you with almost nothing here, while the ancient world left you with everything. Let us begin where the most detailed records begin. Ancient Egypt. The Egyptians were, by any measure, the civilization that thought most seriously and systematically about death. Not because they were obsessed with morbidity, but because they understood something that most modern people have entirely forgotten. That how you die, and more specifically, how prepared you are for what happens after is the most important question a human being can engage with during their lifetime. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is misnamed. It is not a book about death in the sense we mean that word. It is a book of instructions, a precise technical manual for what the soul encounters after the body stops, and how to navigate those encounters successfully. The Egyptians called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day, not going into darkness, coming forth into light. What does it describe? It describes a process that begins the moment the physical body ceases to function. The first thing that happens, according to the Egyptian tradition, is that the Ba, the individual, personal soul, the aspect of you that carries your memories and your character and your particular way of being in the world, separates from the body and begins a journey through what the Egyptians called the Duat. The Duat is usually translated as the underworld, but this translation obscures what the Egyptians actually meant. The Duat is not a place below the earth. It is another dimension of reality, one that interpenetrates this world that exists alongside ordinary physical experience. But that is normally invisible to us because the density of physical embodiment prevents us from perceiving it. At death, that veil lifts. And what the BR encounters in the Duat is not random. It is structured. It follows a sequence that the Egyptian initiates mapped with extraordinary precision across thousands of years of investigation. The first encounter is with what the Egyptians called the Hall of Two Truths, the Hall of Ma'at. This is not a metaphor. The Egyptian tradition presents it as an actual experience that the soul passes through, an encounter with the full weight of everything the individual did and did not do during their lifetime. Every action, every word, every thought that was held for long enough to leave an impression. The symbol the Egyptians used for this encounter is one of the most recognizable in all of human art: the weighing of the heart. The heart of the deceased is placed on one side of a scale. On the other side is the feather of Ma'at, the feather of truth, of cosmic order, of alignment with what is real. If the heart is heavy, if it is weighted down by what the Egyptians called Isfet, the accumulation of actions that were out of alignment with truth, it sinks. And the consequences of that sinking are what the tradition describes as the second death. Not physical dissolution, but something more fundamental. If the heart is light, if a lifetime of action has left it genuinely unburdened, the scales balance. And what comes next is the encounter that the entire Egyptian tradition was designed to prepare the initiate for. The encounter with the Ak. Now let us cross to the other side of the ancient world entirely. Tibet, the Himalayan plateau, a civilization as different from Egypt in its outer form as it is possible to imagine. Different language, different climate, different historical context, different religious structure. And yet, what the Tibetan masters mapped about death is so similar to what the Egyptians described that the parallel cannot be explained by coincidence or cultural borrowing. These two traditions did not know each other existed, and yet they drew the same map. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Thodol, is perhaps the most precise and detailed account of the after-death experience ever written. It was composed, according to the tradition, by Padmasambhava in the 8th century CE and was hidden as a terma, a treasure text, to be discovered when the time was right. It has been used for centuries as a guide, read aloud to the dying and recently dead, to help orient the consciousness through what it is about to encounter. What does it describe? The moment of death, according to the Tibetan tradition, is accompanied by the arising of what is called the clear light of the Dharmata. This is not a metaphor. The Tibetan masters describe it with the precision of people who have investigated this experience directly through years of meditation practice that allowed them to access states of consciousness that ordinary waking experience never reaches. The clear light is the ground state of consciousness itself. It is what awareness actually is when all the contents of experience, all the thoughts, all the perceptions, all the stories about who you are have been stripped away. It is described as luminous, vast, utterly peaceful, and completely without the boundaries and limitations that define ordinary individual experience. And here is the extraordinary thing that the Tibetan tradition teaches about this moment. Most people do not recognize it. The clear light arises at the moment of death, and it is available to every human being without exception. It is not something you need to earn or deserve. It is what you actually are at the deepest level. The naked awareness that underlies every experience you have ever had. But because most people have spent their entire lives identified with the contents of consciousness rather than with consciousness itself, because they have been so completely absorbed in thoughts, perceptions, memories, stories, they do not recognize the clear light when it appears. It is too vast, too unfamiliar, too different from everything they know themselves to be. And so they turn away from it, not deliberately, not with any understanding of what they are turning away from, but because the light is so bright and the familiar sense of individual self is so habitual, the consciousness contracts back toward what it knows. This is the beginning of the Bardo, the intermediate state between death and whatever comes next. And it is precisely here that the Tibetan instructions become most specific. Because what happens in the Bardo is not random. It follows a sequence, and if the consciousness has been prepared, if the dying person has understood, even intellectually, what to expect, the outcome is different. If this is opening something in you, subscribe. And if this is what you have been looking for, leave a like. It tells me to keep going deeper. Now we add a third voice to this conversation. Ancient India, the Vedic tradition, and specifically the teaching on death that appears in one of the most remarkable texts in the history of human thought, the Katha-upanishad. The Katha-upanishad is structured as a dialogue between a young man named Nachiketa and Yama, the god of death himself. Nachiketa has been sent to Yama's realm by his father, and when he arrives, Yama is absent for 3 days. When Yama returns, he offers Nachiketa 3 boons in apology. For his third boon, Nachiketa asks the question that Yama initially refuses to answer. He asks what happens after death. Yama tries everything to dissuade him. He offers wealth, he offers kingdoms, he offers every pleasure the world contains. He tells Nachiketa that even the gods are uncertain about this, that it is the deepest of all mysteries. Nachiketa refuses every alternative. He says, "Of what use are kingdoms and pleasures to a person who does not know what they actually are? Give me the knowledge of what happens after death, or give me nothing." And Yama, recognizing that he is speaking with a soul who is genuinely ready, gives the teaching. What he describes maps precisely onto what Egypt and Tibet described, but from a different angle, using a different vocabulary, arriving at the same essential understanding. He tells Nachiketa, the self that dies is not the self. The individual personality, the person with a name and a history and a collection of memories and relationships, is real at one level, but it's not the deepest level of what you are. It is more like a costume the deeper self wears for a particular lifetime than it is the self itself. The deeper self, what the Vedic tradition calls the Atman, is not born and does not die. It was not created at the moment of your physical birth. It will not be destroyed at the moment of your physical death. What happens at death in the Vedic understanding is that the costume is removed. The individual personality with its particular habits and attachments and unresolved patterns dissolves back into the larger field from which it emerged. But the awareness that animated it, the pure consciousness that made it possible for there to be a subjective experience at all, that does not dissolve, it recognizes itself. And what it recognizes in the Vedic account is identical to what the Tibetan tradition calls the clear light and what the Egyptian tradition calls the Ak, a luminous, boundless awareness that was always the ground of the individual experience, but that the individual experience obscured. Death in this account is not an ending. It is a clarification. The layers that accumulated over a lifetime, the identifications, the fears, the attachments, the accumulated weight of everything that was never resolved, fall away. And what remains is what was always there, what was never born and therefore cannot die. This is not comfort offered to people who cannot face the truth. This is what three of the most rigorous investigative traditions in human history arrived at independently through decades and centuries of direct investigation. And it raises a question that Nachiketa himself raised at the beginning of the dialogue. If this is true, if the self that dies is not the self, then what are we so afraid of? There is a modern thread to this story that most people do not know about. Beginning in the 1970s, a number of physicians and researchers began systematically studying what they called near-death experiences, accounts from people who had been clinically dead, in some cases for extended periods, and who reported remarkably consistent experiences during the time their hearts were not beating and their brains were not registering electrical activity. The research is more rigorous than most people realize. The most careful studies, including the AWARE study conducted by Dr. Sampania at major hospitals in the United Kingdom and United States, were designed specifically to address the skeptical objection that these experiences were simply hallucinations produced by a dying brain. What they found was this: people who were clinically dead reported experiences that were not consistent with what a dying brain would produce. They reported leaving their bodies and observing events in the operating room or emergency room with accuracy that could later be verified. Events that were occurring when their brains were not functioning. They reported entering a different state of consciousness, not the confused, fragmentary experience you would expect from a malfunctioning brain, but something described consistently as more real than ordinary waking experience, more vivid, more lucid, not less. And the content of what they reported maps onto what Egypt and Tibet and India described with extraordinary precision. The encounter with a light, not a physical light, but a presence, described as intelligent, as vast, as unconditionally accepting, as something that makes ordinary waking experience feel like a pale shadow. The life review, not simply a memory playing back, but something experienced as simultaneous. Every moment of the life scene at once, felt from the inside and from the outside, understood in its full context and consequence. The sense that what they were experiencing was not an ending, but a clarification, a removal of something that had been obscuring something else. And the something that had been obscured was not foreign or unfamiliar. It was more like coming home to something you had always known and somehow forgotten. Now, none of this proves what the ancient traditions claimed. The evidence from near-death experiences is compelling but not conclusive. It is consistent with survival of consciousness after death. It is also consistent with other explanations that do not require that conclusion. But here is what is extraordinary. The consistency across traditions and across contemporary reports points to something real. 3 ancient civilizations, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, describe the same structure of what happens at death. And the people who have come closest to death in the modern world, the people who have briefly crossed that threshold and returned, describe the same structure again. This is not coincidence. Something is being pointed at, something that the modern world, for all its sophistication, has almost entirely stopped looking at, something that the ancient traditions considered the most important knowledge a human being could possess. Not because death is the point, because understanding what death is changes what life is. If the awareness that you are does not end at the boundary of the physical body, if the luminous ground of experience that the Tibetans called the clear light and the Egyptians called the Ak and the Vedic tradition called the Atman is genuinely what you are at the deepest level, then the question of what you are afraid of becomes very interesting. And the question of how to live, how to meet each moment, each relationship, each difficulty, each loss becomes different. Not easier necessarily, but different, rooted in something that does not end. Let us come back to the word misunderstanding. Death may be a misunderstanding, not a comfortable reassurance, not the wishful thinking of people who cannot face the truth. A misunderstanding in a very specific sense. What if what we call death is the ending of one thing and the clarification of another? What if what dies, genuinely, finally, completely, is the accumulated weight of everything that was not essentially you? The fears, the identifications, the habitual contractions, the stories about who you are and what you deserve and what is possible for you. The layer upon layer of conditioning that accumulates over a lifetime of living in a world that has almost entirely forgotten what human beings actually are. And what if what remains, what cannot die because it was never born, is the very thing that every ancient civilization that investigated this question arrived at? The luminous ground, the naked awareness, the Ak, the clear light, the Atman. The Tibetan masters taught their students to practice dying before they died, not as a morbid exercise, but because the consciousness that encounters the clear light at death recognizes it or does not recognize it, based on how familiar it has become with its own nature during life. The practice was not preparation for an event that happens once. It was training in recognition. in seeing through the contents of experience to the awareness that contains them. The Egyptian initiates went through a ritual death, a complete dissolution of the ordinary sense of self, as part of their training. What the initiation was designed to do was exactly what the Tibetan practice was designed to do: to make the encounter with the ground of consciousness familiar before it became unavoidable. And the Katha Upanishad ends with something that Yama says to Nachiketa that is worth staying with. He says, "The wise, who know the self to be eternal, awake and ancient, do they grieve for anything? Not do they stop grieving in the ordinary human sense. The losses still happen. The body still ages and fails. The people you love still leave. But the ground from which that grief is met, the awareness that receives the loss, that holds the experience of loss, that is present through the grief and beyond it, that does not age, that does not diminish, that was not given to you at birth and cannot be taken from you at death." This is what the ancient traditions were pointing at, not an abstract philosophical position, not a belief you are asked to adopt without evidence, a direction, an investigation, a map drawn by people who had looked more carefully at this question than perhaps anyone in human history, and who left their findings intact, encoded in texts and traditions and lineages that have survived everything the intervening centuries have thrown at them. The map exists, the territory is real, and the question that Nachiketa asked at the threshold of death's own domain, the question that Yama tried to deflect and then finally answered, is the same question that is alive in every human being who has ever stood at a graveside and felt the full weight of not knowing. What actually happens? The ancient traditions gave a clear answer. They did not speculate, they investigated, and what they found across civilizations and centuries in completely different outer forms was the same finding. Consciousness does not end, it clarifies. And in that clarification, what has always been real becomes, for the first time, unmistakably visible. What do you do with a map this precise, drawn by people who got as close to death as anyone ever has? And that keeps pointing in the same direction. There is something extraordinary that all three of these traditions share, something that goes beyond their descriptions of what happens after death and cuts directly to the question of what to do about it now, while you are still alive. Every one of them developed a practice of dying before you die. Not metaphorically, not as a therapeutic exercise in confronting mortality, as a literal, systematic, carefully transmitted technology for doing in life what death will do inevitably, stripping away everything that is not essentially you and discovering what remains. The Tibetan tradition is perhaps the most explicit about this. The entire system of Tibetan Buddhist meditation practice, from the most basic mindfulness exercises to the most advanced practices of Dzogchen and Mahamudra, is at its deepest level a preparation for the moment of death. Every session of meditation is a rehearsal. Every time a meditator learns to let go of a thought, to watch it arise, to not follow it, to allow it to dissolve, they are practicing the fundamental movement that death will demand. The release of the contents of experience, the recognition of the awareness that underlies the contents. The Tibetan masters describe the moment of death as the ultimate examination, not an examination that judges you, an examination that reveals you. What you have been practicing your entire life is what you will naturally do in that moment. If you have spent your life chasing the contents of experience, grabbing at pleasant sensations, fleeing from unpleasant ones, building elaborate structures of identity and preference and self-concept, then when the contents dissolve at death, you will be disoriented. You will turn away from the vastness of the clear light because nothing in your experience has prepared you to recognize it as home. But if you have practiced, even imperfectly, even partially, the recognition of awareness itself, independent of its contents, then the clear light that arises at death is not foreign. It is familiar. It is the same recognition you touched in meditation, now fully revealed without any veil remaining. The Egyptian tradition encoded the same understanding in its initiation rituals. The initiate underwent a symbolic death, a complete dissolution of the ordinary sense of self. In the innermost chamber of the temple, they were placed in darkness. They were stripped of their name, their role, their social identity. Everything that constituted the ordinary person was temporarily removed. And in that removal, they encountered what the ordinary person had been obscuring. The Greeks, who were initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, which were deeply influenced by Egyptian thought, came away from the initiation with a single transformative understanding that changed everything about how they lived. We do not know exactly what they saw. The mysteries were genuinely secret, but the testimony of those who underwent initiation is consistent. They lost their fear of death, not because they were comforted with pleasant beliefs, but because they directly encountered something that made the fear irrelevant. The Vedantic tradition encodes this in the practice of self-inquiry. The question, "Who am I?" is not a philosophical puzzle to be solved intellectually. It is an investigation to be pursued directly in experience until the questioner arrives at what cannot be taken away. The Atman that Yama described to Nachiketa is not a belief to be adopted. It is something to be recognized in this life, in this body, before the body stops. The instruction that all three traditions give is the same instruction stated in three different languages. Practice dying now, not as morbidity, as the most life-affirming investigation available to a human being. Because what you discover in that practice is not darkness. It is not emptiness in the nihilistic sense. It is the recognition of what you actually are. The luminous ground that was always here, that was never damaged by anything that happened to you, that does not age or diminish, that was present in your first moment of consciousness and will be present in your last. And that recognition changes everything about how you live the time between. Let us return to the modern thread for a moment, because there is something about the near-death experience research that most summaries leave out. Something that is, in many ways, more significant than the experiences themselves. What happens to people afterward? The transformation that follows a near-death experience is one of the most consistent and well-documented phenomena in the entire field of consciousness research. It is not subtle. It is not gradual. It is, in most cases, immediate, total, and permanent. People who have had near-death experiences do not come back the same. They come back fundamentally different. And the direction of that difference is consistent across cultures, across ages, across religious backgrounds, across the entire spectrum of human diversity. The fear of death disappears, not diminishes, disappears. People who were previously terrified of death, who avoided the topic, who could not attend funerals, who experienced panic at the thought of their own mortality. Come back from a near-death experience with a serenity about death that strikes everyone around them. They know something they did not know before, and what they know makes the fear irrelevant. The fear of death disappearing is only the beginning. What replaces it in virtually every account, from every culture, from every century that these experiences have been documented, is an overwhelming, unconditional orientation toward love. Not romantic love, not the love between individuals, though that deepens too, something more fundamental. A recognition that love, in the sense of complete, unconditional acceptance of what is not a feeling that arises sometimes and disappears at other times. It is the fundamental nature of what reality actually is at its deepest level. NDEers come back with this recognition and find themselves disoriented in a world that operates on very different assumptions. They lose interest in competition, in status, in accumulation. They find themselves unable to maintain the social pretenses that seemed important before. They become, sometimes uncomfortably, honest, because the experience showed them that what matters is not what other people think of you, but what you actually are. Kenneth Ring, one of the most rigorous researchers in this field, documented these transformations systematically across hundreds of cases. His finding was unambiguous. The near-death experience does not just change beliefs about death. It changes the experience's relationship to life, to other people, to themselves. And here is what is most extraordinary about this transformation. It exactly mirrors what the ancient traditions described as the fruit of their deepest practices. The Egyptian initiate who underwent the ritual death in the temple emerged transformed in precisely this way. With the fear dissolved, with love as the new orientation, with a clarity about what actually matters, that the ordinary person, still identified with the surface of experience, cannot access. The Tibetan master, who has fully recognized the nature of mind, lives in this orientation permanently, not as an achievement, but as a natural consequence of seeing clearly. The Vedantic sage, who has recognized the Atman, lives in the condition that the Upanishads call Jivamukta, liberated while still in the body, not because they have escaped anything, but because they have recognized that what they are was never in bondage to begin with. The convergence is not coincidental. The ancient traditions and the contemporary near-death experiences are pointing at the same recognition from two different directions. The traditions approach it through deliberate practice and preparation over a lifetime. The NDEers stumble into it accidentally through the involuntary dissolution of the boundary between ordinary experience and the ground that underlies it. But they arrive at the same place. And what they find there, every one of them, across every tradition, across every century, is not what the modern world expects to find at the boundary of death. It is not darkness. It is not ending. It is not the cold silence of mere matter. It is recognition. It is warmth. It is the overwhelming sense of having come home to something that was always here, that was, in fact, what you were made of all along. There is one more dimension of what the ancient traditions agreed on that we have not yet fully explored. What happens not just in the immediate aftermath of death, the encounter with the light, the life review, the dissolution of the individual personality into the larger field, but over a longer arc. The question of what comes next after what comes next. The answer that Egypt, Tibet and India all gave, independently, using different symbols and different technical vocabularies, is the same answer. Consciousness returns. Not in the sense of a ghost haunting familiar places. Not in any of the popular caricatures of reincarnation that reduce it to a simple recycling of personalities, but in a more precise and more interesting sense than any of those popular images capture. The Egyptian tradition describes this through the concept of the Ka, the life force that animates the individual, distinct from the Ba that carries personal memory and character, and distinct from the Ak that is the immortal luminous spirit. The Ka does not die with the body. It carries the imprint of everything that was unresolved in the life just completed. Every action whose consequences were not yet fully met. Every pattern of being that was not yet fully understood. Every movement toward truth that was begun but not completed. And that imprint in the Egyptian understanding becomes the seed of the next expression of consciousness in physical form. The Tibetan tradition describes the same process with extraordinary precision in the third section of the Bardo Thodol, the Sidpa Bardo, the Bardo of becoming. After the initial encounter with the clear light, and after the encounter with the peaceful and wrathful deities of the Chonyid Bardo, the consciousness that has not yet recognized its own nature begins to be drawn toward rebirth, not randomly, not arbitrarily, but in accordance with the karma accumulated in previous lives, the patterns of action and reaction, of grasping and aversion, of clarity and confusion that have been building across multiple lifetimes. The Tibetan masters teach that the circumstances of the next birth are not punishment or reward. They are the natural consequence of what the consciousness has been. The next chapter of an investigation that began long before this lifetime and will continue long after it. The Vedantic tradition uses the metaphor of the jiva, the individual soul, moving from body to body the way a person moves from room to room in a large house. The rooms change, the furniture changes, the people in each room are different, but the one who moves through the rooms is continuous, carrying the impressions and the learning and the unresolved questions from every room that came before. What is remarkable about all three of these accounts is not just their convergence on the fact of return, but their convergence on the purpose of return. Consciousness does not return to physical form because it is trapped. It returns because the physical world is the arena in which certain kinds of learning are only possible in embodied form. The friction of life, the difficulty of relationships, the resistance of matter, the experience of limitation and loss and longing is not an obstacle to the soul's development. It is the instrument of it. The Egyptian tradition speaks of the soul accumulating wisdom across many lifetimes, progressively resolving the karma that binds it to the cycle of rebirth, progressively purifying the heart until the heart is light enough that the scales of Mahat balance perfectly and the soul is ready for what the tradition calls the final union with Ra, the return to the source from which individual consciousness originally emerged. The Tibetan tradition speaks of the Bodhisattva, the being who has reached the threshold of complete liberation but chooses to return lifetime after lifetime until every sentient being has been guided home, not out of obligation, out of the natural expression of what consciousness is, when it fully recognizes its own nature. Love that has become so complete, it cannot remain separate from those who are still lost in confusion. And the Vedantic tradition speaks of the soul's gradual recognition across many lifetimes of inquiry and practice of what it always already was, each life another step in the recognition. Each death a temporary clarification that shows more clearly what was always there. The same map, 3 languages, 1 territory, and in each tradition the journey has a direction, a movement towards something, not an endless wheel of meaningless repetition, but a purposeful arc. Consciousness gradually recognizing itself, gradually releasing what obscures it, gradually coming home to what it always was. Death is not the end of that arc. It is a rest stop on a journey that is moving, always toward recognition. So what do you do with all of this? Not as philosophy, not as something interesting to think about and then set aside, but as something that is actually true, if even a fraction of what 3 of the most rigorous investigative traditions in human history agreed on is accurate. What do you do with a map this precise, drawn by people who got as close to death as anyone ever has, and that keeps pointing in the same direction? The first thing the ancient traditions would say is this: stop treating the question of death as something to be deferred. The modern world has made an art form of deferring this question. We fill our lives with distraction and noise and activity and acquisition. Not because these things are wrong in themselves, but because underneath all of it, there is a terror that we have never faced directly. The terror of not knowing, the terror of the boundary that we cannot see past, the terror that what we are might simply stop. The ancient traditions do not ask you to stop that terror with belief. They ask you to face it directly, and in facing it directly, to discover that what you were terrified of losing is not what you thought it was. You are not the story you have been telling about yourself. You are not the accumulation of memories and preferences and relationships and achievements that constitute the ordinary sense of personal identity. These are real. They matter. They are part of what this life is. But they are not the deepest layer of what you are. The deepest layer of what you are is what the Tibetans call Rigpa, the naked awareness that underlies every experience you have ever had. It was present in your earliest memory. It is present right now as you listen to these words, as the words arise in it and dissolve back into it. It will be present at the moment of your death, when everything else has been stripped away. And according to every tradition that has investigated this directly, it will be present after. The second thing the traditions would say is this: live from that recognition as much as you can now. Not as an achievement, not as something to be earned through years of meditation or study, but as a direction, a leaning, a willingness to notice in the middle of ordinary life, in the middle of conversation, in the middle of difficulty, in the middle of loss, that the awareness in which all of this is happening is not touched by any of it. The grief is real, the loss is real, the difficulty is real. The traditions are not asking you to pretend otherwise. They are pointing to something that holds all of it, something that is moved by life without being damaged by it, something that can meet even the hardest experiences without contracting into the desperate self-protection that makes those experiences so much harder than they need to be. The third thing and perhaps the most important thing, that the traditions point to is this: death is not what is coming for you. What is coming for you is recognition. Recognition of what you already are. Recognition that was always possible. That every moment of genuine stillness and genuine love and genuine presence was already pointing toward. Recognition that the ancient traditions spent thousands of years mapping. Not to give you something you lack, but to show you what you already have. What you have always had. What cannot be taken from you because it was never given to you. It was always there. It is there now. The Egyptians called it the Akh. The Tibetans called it Rigpa. The Vedantic tradition called it Atman. The near-death experiencers call it the light, the overwhelming, unconditional, welcoming light that feels more like home than any place they have ever been. They were all pointing at the same thing, and the extraordinary invitation that all of them extend across thousands of years and thousands of miles, and every difference of language and culture and outer form, is simply this: you do not have to wait until death to discover what you are. The recognition is available now. The map exists. The territory is real. And you are already standing in it. What do you do with that?